Welcome to What of the Ground We Are Standing On. This topic is one that is so close to my heart, and I really hope that you enjoy the discussion about rewilding, biodiversity loss, and our connection to the other within our world. It was recorded at the end of February, so it's taken a little while to germinate, and I hope that means that it is blooming at just the right time. Enjoy.
This time around, we're just going to start off with a story and see where it takes us. And I'm particularly excited because I don't know it yet. And looking forward to hearing your story as a starting point.
Excellent. Yeah. No, when we met online just a few minutes ago, we were like, okay, where are we going with the story or discussion point? And as usual, we haven't planned anything particularly. And I was thinking, okay, what stories are coming up? And for me, there's been a couple of stories that have suggested themselves. But at the moment, I think this time of year, I don't know how it is in Germany, but we have snowdrops, we have daffodils starting to appear, we have the birds. The birds are singing in the mornings, they are re-establishing all their territories, they're beginning to nest and build again. Everything feels full of hope and possibility. And 4 nights ago, I was out for a walk in the evening and a bat flew past me. And I was like, oh, wow, okay, it's definitely spring then if the bats are on the wing. And creation stories, I think, I'm working with a creation story at the moment for the Scottish Crannog Centre that I'll be telling at the end of March as part of their big grand opening at their new site. And this story that I want to share with you just now is one of the first stories that I actually told at an online storytelling event. And it's a story that I very much feel came through me. It was a story that has been sitting with me in my time in the hills in Scotland. My local glen, Glen Esk, is known as the Glen of the Rowan Trees, and it was filled with rowan trees at one point in time, and now there are still a lot of rowan trees, but not nearly as many as there used to be. And one day after walking up to the top of the glen, it was an 8-9 hour walk just round exploring the mountains and the streams, I came down. And this area is used for shooting, grouse shooting, deer stalking, pheasants being released into the woods, all the rest of it. So there's a lot of that goes on, and that really, for me, affects the land and the landscape in such a obvious way, particularly at this time of year, because at the moment, the hills are on fire. This is the time of year that they set fire to the hills to suppress the growth, to make sure that the trees don't regenerate, so that the short heather comes up for the grouse to eat, which is part of a process that has happened for a very long time, but it's the fact that it is so all-consuming. There is nothing on the hills but heather and deer grass. And it was not always so. And so I would like to share this story with you. Come with me, back through the swirling mists of time to when the memory of the ice that covered everything could still be tasted on the land. Scotland then was a bleak and barren place. This steep-sided glen was grey. Moraine, the sifted loose rock from the glaciers, covered the valley floor and skirted up the hills on either side. Not a thing stirred. Well, if you looked more closely at the rocks, you would see that even here in this moonscape, there was life. because you see, lichen was beginning to cover the rocks and everything. Algal cells photosynthesizing in the so welcome sunlight, fungi breaking down and digesting the minerals, the rocks themselves turning to soils. Moss was growing here and there, and simple soils were indeed forming. And something else was stirring too. A little further up the glen, on a rocky outcrop, a bird landed just a little while ago. A waxwing, I think it was, and it had left a deposit. And in this deposit was a seed that slowly began to unfurl and grow. And she grew and grew and unfurled delicate green leaves that looked very much like feathers. It was a rowan tree. A rowan tree, the first tree in the valley. And she stood on that rocky outcrop and looked down to the river, winding its way through the moraine down toward the shining sea. And she thought, yes, this is a good place to grow. And grow she did. She grew and was joined by other plants, other trees that were carried on seeds from here and there in the stomachs of birds, and then on the coats and stomachs of animals as they too entered the valley. Her children began to grow in the soils, and while it was hard those first few decades, adding compost year on year, the leaves that fell in the autumn and the shoots that appeared in the spring, soon the valley was filled with her children and the children of all the other plants and animals, and was a rich, green, verdant place. The air hummed with the noise of insects, flying from tree to tree, flower to flower. Animals scurried, hopped, ran, jumped from here and there. It was a wonderful place, and she stood on her rocky outcrop looking down and thought, yes, this is a good place for my children to grow. Bands of wandering humans entered the glen, and they marvelled at the riches, at the verdant lushness, at the soils that were so rich and capable of sustaining life. They learnt from the animals how to find shelter and medicines. From the plants they learnt how to grow and to build. And soon, after a few generations, they decided to stay. And they saw the rowan tree on the rocky outcrop, and they called her Brid, mother of all, and they asked for her protection. And she was pleased. She was glad that they fitted with the seasons that they learnt from the others that lived here too. And she offered herself to them. And in front of each house, made of stone and turf and timber, a rowan tree was planted to ask for protection. And any time one of the residents of that place left the valley, they would reach up and take a branch from their rowan tree and put it in their pack and take it with them as a talisman to remember where they came from and that they would always have a home here. And so life was good. And the rowan tree looked down and smiled, and she saw how the people were growing vegetables and crops around their houses. They had to clear areas of the tree to expand the farms and to collect firewood and so on. They hunted the deer. They began to change their relationship with the land over time, but still they respected the old ways. But eventually more people entered the valley, ones who did not know the old roots of the magic of place, and they cleared more of the forests. More of the land was turned over to agriculture, to growth, and the soils without the tree roots to bind them began to lose their nutrients. When the rains fell down in March, the minerals washed into the river and were carried to the sea. And soon the soils themselves became unstable, and the people had to clear even the trees on the slopes so that they could plant more crops. But these, again, accelerated the process, and the soils became more and more depleted year on year until nothing would grow except for the heather and the millennia, the deer grass. And the deer wandered lost on bare open hills, wondering where their forests had gone. The people began to leave because there was nothing left here for them either. There was not the richness of life, there were not the opportunities that there had been once before, or maybe the people were cleared from the land because sheep were more profitable. And the sheep, well, they grazed on the heather and the millennia, but they much preferred the tender woodland plants, devouring them whenever they were found. And the lonely rowan tree, standing on the rocky outcrop, well, she stood and she watched as her valley became bare once more. But there was hope. There is always hope, because you see, year after year, she still saw her children germinate and grow. And even though they were bitten down by the sheep and the starving deer, they were still there. And she knew that the land remembered. And the people also remembered. The people knew it in their souls, in their bones, that this place had once been vibrant. And people began to notice her. One lonely rowan tree standing on an outcrop high in the valley, all on her own, in a place where trees did not grow, a place where trees could not grow. Maybe they could, if they were given the chance. And the sheep and the deer were excluded for a period of time, and trees were planted once more. And without the browsing pressure, the rowan tree's children began to grow. And the plants that had been hidden in the soil, waiting for their chance to bloom once more, foxgloves, bluebells, wood sorrel, all began to grow. And the valley once more became a rich and vibrant place, and the rowan tree stood on her rocky outcrop and smiled. Yes, this is a good place to grow.
Magical. You truly are a wordsmith, a silversmith of words. Thank you. That was gorgeous.
Thank you. I do love that story, and I love the fact that while it's my story and I came up with the words, I was very much, it was the rowan tree that told me to tell this story, I feel. I was up, as I said, at the top of the glen, and there are lots of rowan trees on rocky outcrops, but most of the hills are still bare, and we are having an ongoing debate in Scotland, in the UK, I think, at the moment, about how we use our lands and our value that is placed on the natural environment. There's a big drive, the area I live in, because the shooting industry is so big here, it is a major employer, except it's not. Very few people are employed full time by the shooting estates because they just don't actually make very much money. In the past, my local glen would have had over 1,000 people living and being supported by the land. Now it's maybe 6 people who are supported by the shooting estate. So it's a real shift in how do we see what we're doing to the land, how do we get invested in it? And if you speak to people who are involved in the shooting industry, they are very, very passionate about what they do and their connection to the land and their love of the land and the value that they see that it brings to the area. But it's very different from the value that could be here with a different mindset, I believe.
Oh, wow. Such richness. I don't even know where to begin. Maybe first of all, a line from a song. Is it Bob Dylan who sang "And the times they are a changing"? I'm just glad that debate is happening. You know,
Yes.
it's high time that debate happened. And I remember when I was traveling Scotland, where was that museum? Rora, I believe. Somewhere on the East Coast. There's a museum that has to do with the Highland clearances, and they had a room. I don't know if they still have it, but it was there then. They had a room that was dedicated to the last wolf. And they showed an amazing sort of a video collage and a voice, like you were sitting in a darkened room looking at that video, hearing a voice, and it was such a compelling story of how that last wolf existed and then didn't cease to exist, and the deer that took over everything, and this sort of it's a monoculture, isn't it? I mean, yes, understand the people working there, understand their plight, and yet at the same time, monoculture is never sustainable. It just isn't. Oh, what an amazing story.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, yes, it is basically a monoculture. There is heather, but the heather is becoming degraded as well because of grazing pressures and all the rest of it. Millennia, the deer grass, is one of the main things that is taking over the hills. I mean, the hills in Scotland mostly look brown due to the millennia and the heather, which, I mean, I have to say, in August, the heather does look beautiful when it's blooming and it's purple and all the rest of it, and that is gorgeous. And we lack the mosaic of different biodiversity types. And that is a real source of anguish for me. If you go out and you survey the hills, yes, there is some diversity. So it's not just one or two species. There are maybe 20 species. But compared to an active woodland, it's ridiculous. So I think there's a real thing about that, and resilience. This idea of being sustainable, of having nutrients added back to the soils. Our soils in Scotland are so depleted because there is nothing to hold the goodness in. I mean, at the moment, I'm teaching a weather unit, so I also work as a geography teacher occasionally, and I'm teaching some teenagers about weather and about climate and about soils and that whole interaction between them. And yes, in Scotland, we have a relatively high rainfall, but not compared to many places. I mean, the west coast of Portugal gets more rainfall than Scotland does, for example. But we don't think of that. I mean, you've got the cold and all the rest of it. But the fact that it rains and it interacts with the soil, and with the flooding that we've had over the last year, the soils are just really saturated. The more vegetation we have in those, then the more is actually brought up out of the soils, the more capillary action that's going on, all the rest of it that turns things around. And I think we have a real challenge at the moment, culturally, socially, and with our hearts, about how we understand these processes.
Yeah. Same thing here. Different sort of environment, but same topics. I just have to glance out of my window and I see, like, the region that I live in, the Allgäu, is completely over farmed. Like, it's so romantic. People come here for the green, the lush green hills, but they are completely, yeah, depleted of anything valuable. And so every year, several times a year, they throw shit onto those fields, and like, we cannot even leave our houses because it's so bad. It's so bad. The ammonia just makes you choke. And imagine, all the inhabitants of those fields, all the beings that are, you know, that are exposed to that. And yeah, there's a lot we have to learn, relearn, and unlearn around these issues. And when you were telling the story, I also thought about, there's a couple. I'm not sure whether they're in Spain or Portugal or somewhere in a hot, dry climate, and they bought a valley 30 years ago, and they started planting trees. And there's pictures have gone viral of them 30 years later standing in the same spot, and it was barren land, and now it is green. It is completely covered in trees. It has water. It's a completely different microclimate that they have created. And so it can be done. That's what frustrates me. So often I find, wow, the solutions are there. It's not as though they didn't exist. It's not as though we didn't know this stuff. So where's the catch? What are we doing? Why the wait? You know? And it doesn't matter which area of life you look at. It's the same thing everywhere. Like, it seems we're flooded with information, but we lack wisdom.
Yes, no, I think that's a really key phrase. We do have the information, it's just where's the wisdom to actually carry it through. I mean, for me, biodiversity loss is the biggest issue I think the world is facing. We can talk about whatever else is going on, which there are truly horrific things going on, and it all comes from the same root as far as I'm concerned. It's this lack of connection, this lack of rootedness in our land, this lack of connection to each other, whether that is human other or other species, other landforms, ways of being within the world. I think there's a huge deficit. Deforestation is massive. I mean, we're looking at, if the rates of deforestation in the Amazon and in Southeast Asia carry on, then by the end of the century, we're going to have a couple of new deserts, because that is how important trees are. I mean, the rainforests rain because there are trees there, because the trees put the moisture back up into the air and cause the rain to fall. If you remove the trees, you don't get that anymore. The soils wash away, the trees can't grow, none of the transpiration happens, the rain doesn't fall. So you're looking at a stage where, yeah, we're going to lose major bioregions, climate systems, all the rest of it, if we don't start connecting again with the biodiversity and how important it is to us, because that shifts weather patterns, it changes resources. I mean, if we're going to, yeah, when I was at uni looking at sustainability, we had this whole thing about valuing nature and how we value it in monetary terms, because it seems that the bottom line in terms of capitalism is you have to have a monetary value attached to everything, otherwise how can we value it? And for me, that was such a challenging concept to think value could only be in monetary terms. I ended up doing my whole thesis research on it because I was like, hang on a minute, values are so important, and it's not actually to do with the money. How we interact with our land and our landscape totally changes based on our values and who we are, and we totally change depending on our relationship and our interactions with our landscapes and so on. So it's definitely a reciprocal process, and we need to get back to that feeling of reciprocity and how we are part of everything, and everyone and everything is part of us as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it makes me think of funny. Do you know the Celestine Prophecy? Have you read it? Okay. Won't go into details, but it's a very spiritual book, and yes, old school spirituality and everything. But one concept that I love in that book is that plants become very, very important in the in the rising of humanity. And there's the author or authors that describe this reciprocity as an energetic exchange. So you've got people sitting in front of plants, opening up their senses to receive the wisdom and the energy of those plants and to give back. It's a circle, and magical stuff happens from that. And it makes me think of the importance of storytelling again, because we have the information, but it isn't sinking in, because it's so overwhelming and because we're so distracted. And no movie, no video game, nothing is going to open up your heart the way that a story does when told face to face, or if you listen at least to a voice of a storyteller. And so I think it's so important, the work that you do, like a story like the one we just heard. The most important part of that story to me is that the round tree comes across as a wise being. And that's, to me, that's one of the main points. When we cut down these ancient beings, we lose the wisdom. And so, in addition to having too much information, the wisdom gets less and less and less because we remove them out of the picture. And it's so funny. You should be telling a story now. We're recording this on the 29th of February, and that in Germany is the last day in the year that you're allowed to cut trees, because then the season, come March, you can't. And so the past week, I've seen a lot of trees being cut down here. And my sister-in-law and her husband, they have a property, like a house in town, and there were such beautiful beech trees all around that house, and they were huge and ancient, and they have been cut down because now apparently people need parking lots. And it was like a bomb scene. Like I when I arrived there, it was a shock. It was like, what happened here? Like, and I can feel the grief that the place now holds because of what has been done there. Um, and so, yeah, in addition to everything you mentioned, there's the energetic aspect, the otherworldly beings that we drive away when we do this. And so telling stories and listening to the land and allowing the land to tell stories through us, I think is a very important part of making sure that we don't forget completely. Because so much, I mean, we talked about this before, um, it's this aspect of tending the fires, of keeping the memories alive. Because in many areas, I think there's just no stopping this momentum that's going, as harsh as it is, as terrible as that is. But in darkest times, we have to make sure that the fire stays lit, even if it's a tiny glow. And I think storytellers, that it's all part of that picture.
Absolutely, yeah. And for me, stories are where we carry the ancient knowledge. And I mean, the oldest stories we have are thousands of years old. The roots of those stories go back thousands and thousands of years. And they are, the more that I learn about stories, the more I realize that these are the seeds that carry the wisdom that will take us forward into the future. I mean, so I've been involved in environmental education my entire adult life. It's been a really big thing for me. And one thing that I know to be true, because I feel it in my bones, is that stories are the most important part of that. I mean, I have done environmental education from a science-based background of this is how different ecosystems work, all the rest of it. I can take people out into the environment, we can do ID, all the rest, and it's all valid forms of knowledge. And there are different ways that we know and understand the world. But for me, it's that emotional heart connection, because unless we love something, unless we care about it, unless we know about it, why should we be invested? And I think for me, stories are that bit that helps us to invest, because if we hear a story, it then becomes part of us and part of our own stories as well, and taking that forward into the future. If we can keep these fires alive, these little glowing embers even, then at some point they can be relit and spark the imagination. And I think that is really important at the moment. The world is going through so much upheaval and change and pain, but our stories are the things that we can carry with us, regardless of who we are and where we are and what we're facing. I've told a couple of stories as part of the Tell a Child in Gaza story, and these are children who haven't been heard from for 5 months. We don't know if they're still alive. We don't know if they still have their homes. We don't know what conditions they're living in at the moment. But these are children who were excited about story because stories were what brought them joy and lit them up and connected them to each other and to the world. So they were telling these stories in the World Storytelling Cafe, having the opportunity to practice, to share, to exchange. And I think it's really important to honour the connection that we have with people right around the world and other beings right around the world by telling their stories, because we have to tell each other's stories so that we remember, so that we remain part of this unified world that it would be wonderful if we were.
Yeah.
I love the fact that in olden times and today, the concept of sitting around a fire and telling stories is just one that speaks to us so clearly. It's like you can be anywhere, and even hearing, I mean, Grampian Association of Storytellers, who I'm involved with, this month we had a session on speaking in your mother tongue, telling stories in your mother tongue. And it was wonderful to listen to a story in another language and not actually know what was being told, but it didn't matter because that emotion was still there. That pace, that tone, that connection, eye to eye, heart to heart, all the rest of it was still there. And you can feel it. And when people get together and tell, doesn't matter what language you're telling in, it doesn't matter where you are, you can still feel that emotion and that connection, which is why for me stories are so important.
Yeah. And that makes me think of, how there are studies that the, the communication process is 10% the words and 90% body and everything else. And isn't that funny? Like, so it seems like stories are but a portal to something else that we then communicate when we do this. That's the feeling I get, is that wherever I go to tell stories, the number of people that can't relate is so minuscule. And there's always someone or whatever, but there's something there. There's a deeper layer there that we address when we tell stories, and that we also obviously are tapping into, or else we wouldn't be emitting these energies. And it's something inherent, I think, in the human experience. And also it's something that can be done without any without a crutch, without props, you don't need anything. Just yourself.
Yes, and I think that's part of the magic of storytelling, is it is within us. And I also think that it is within the other species that we share our environments with. Just as you were talking there, I was thinking of listening to a story in another language and remembering seeing a wren down by the river who was just singing full of life, but it felt like it was telling me a story. And I thought, just as you said that about only 10% of the words, I thought, well, actually, if we listen to the birds, to the trees, to whatever, then okay, we're only missing 10% of it, maybe. I mean, not quite, because we're a different species, so there is that barrier, but telling the stories of these things, these other species, is so important, but listening to them is even more important. And I think for me, that is really interesting. I've also just remembered when I was in Northern Ireland last summer, I went to Slemish, which is this mountain, this hill that stands proud, this dome that looks out over the sea, and it's where St. Patrick grew up as a boy and was well, effectively a slave child, looking after the sheep on the hill. And it is still a hill that is covered in sheep, but it is also covered in hawthorns, because hawthorns are the fairy tree. And in Ireland, you would never cut down a fairy tree because, well, they're the fairy trees. They are a connection to the other world, and the wee folk would not be happy with you, and misfortune would befall and all the rest of it. And I thought it was so interesting standing on this hill that is quite bare, covered in green grass, but has this profusion of hawthorn trees as well. And it did make me think about the importance of stories in our relationship with the rowan tree, the hawthorn tree, the beech trees near your sister-in-law's house, all the rest of it. We have stories, we have connections, we have ways that we understand them, and we have relationship with them. And often that is mediated either by a personal story or a societal wide story about how we relate to these things.
I think that's perhaps a good point to end this discussion for today. Just the awareness of the interrelatedness of all that is. It comes back to that time and time again. And we forget, and then we have to remember, and we forget again, and then we have to remember again. And, well, I guess my prayer or my wish is that this podcast adds a little bit of something to this ongoing process of remembering, you know, that we can be part of a bigger picture of reassembling who we truly are as a species, as a community on this planet with other species. Yeah.
Yeah, we are members of the same community. And my urge, I guess, for people would be to go out and listen to a story. Listen to a story from a tree or a plant or a bird or whatever it happens to be that you come across over the course of the next few days. Just stop and take a minute to listen to their story. What are they telling you? What knowledge are they sharing? What emotion are they trying to connect with?
And feel free to comment after you've done that. If you want to share something about that story, please do let us know. You know where to find us.
And thank you once again to everybody for joining us. We really do appreciate everybody that takes the time to listen, and we just want to send you lots of love.